She was standing at parade rest on a stretch of Alabama tarmac, hot enough to cook through boot leather, and Sergeant First Class Dale Brower was walking the line like he owned every inch of Fort Novosel and everyone on it. It was 06:30. The sun had barely cleared the pine trees at the east end of the airfield, and already the air tasted like jet fuel and red clay and the particular flavor of dread that only a military morning can manufacture. 19 candidates stood in formation. 19 candidates who had passed their SAFE scores, cleared their flight physicals, survived the paperwork and the interviews and the waiting, all of it just to stand here in the Alabama heat and let Dale Brower decide what kind of people they were. Brower was not a big man, but he moved like one. Broad through the shoulders, thick neck, a face that looked like it had been carved from the same red clay the state was built on. He wore his campaign cover low over his eyes, and he walked the line slowly, methodically, the way a man walks when he already knows what he's going to say and is just enjoying the delay. He stopped in front of candidate Lena Carr. She was 5'6", slight across the shoulders, with dark hair pulled back tight under her cover, and eyes the color of gunmetal in low light. She had not looked at him since formation began. She was looking at a point 12 inches above the tree line, the way you learn to look when you want someone to understand that nothing they say is going to touch you. Brower took his time. He stepped close enough that she could hear him breathing through his nose, slow and deliberate. He looked her up and down the way you'd inspect a piece of equipment you already planned to send back. "Carr," he said, not a question. "Yes, Sergeant. You know what I see when I look at you, Carr." She said nothing. That was the right answer. "I see 130 pounds of paperwork," he said. "I see someone who passed a test on a computer in an air-conditioned room and thought that meant she belonged out here." He let that sit. "You know how many female candidates I've run through this program in 9 years?" "No, Sergeant." 11, he said. "You know how many made it through phase 2? She didn't answer. 3, he said. And those 3 had something in common. He leaned slightly closer. None of them looked like they were about to fall over in a breeze. He turned away, moved down the line. "Weakest candidate I've seen in 9 years, he said, loud enough for all 19 of them to hear. "Write it down. That's an official Brower assessment." Someone down the line exhaled a quiet laugh. Just a sound, barely a breath. Lena Carr did not move. She did not blink. She kept her eyes on that point above the tree line, and whatever was happening behind those gunmetal eyes, she was keeping it entirely to herself. There was a file on Lena Carr that did not exist in any database accessible from Fort Novosel. It existed in one server, in one building, in one corridor of the Pentagon, that required a separate badge and a separate escort and a retinal scan that changed its algorithm every 30 days. The file was not classified secret. It was not classified top secret. It existed in a category that most people with high-level clearances had never heard of, and it listed a woman who had accumulated 1,847 flight hours in rotary wing aircraft, 312 of them at night, 218 of them in combat conditions, and 64 of them in environments so restricted that the coordinates were scrubbed from the record entirely. It listed a woman who had flown 3 MH-60M Black Hawks out of a burning forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, with no ground crew, no air traffic control, no functioning nav systems, and 11 wounded soldiers in the back of the last bird, who had landed all 3. who had gone back for a fourth run when everyone in the command tent told her the LZ was too hot, and she had responded by simply taking off. The file listed a call sign, NIGHTWATCH. The file listed a unit, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, 1st Battalion, B Company, the Night Stalkers. Lena Carr had been flying with the Night Stalkers for 6 years before she requested a transfer to the standard Army aviation pipeline. The request had come in on a Tuesday, filed through channels so obscure that it took 3 days for anyone to find the right desk to land it on. When they did, the officer who received it read it twice, then called the person above him, who called the person above them. And eventually the request reached a general who had been in the business long enough to understand what it meant when a Night Stalker asked to disappear into the regular training pipeline. It meant she needed to disappear for a reason, and generals who understood that kind of thing also understood that you didn't ask what the reason was. You approved the transfer, you scrubbed the relevant sections of her service record from the systems that the receiving post would query, and you made sure that what arrived at Fort Novosel was a candidate file thin enough to look like a first-timer, which was exactly what Brower had seen that morning, which was exactly what she needed him to see. The program at Fort Novosel ran in phases. Phase 1 was ground school, systems, aerodynamics, weather, regulations, emergency procedures. It lasted 3 weeks and covered everything from the fundamental physics of rotary wing lift to the specific emergency checklists for every aircraft in the Army aviation inventory, to the weather minimums required for different classes of flight operations. It was comprehensive, and it was fast, and it was designed to load a candidate with more information than they could comfortably hold, on the working theory that the candidates who retained it were the ones who had the cognitive architecture for what came next. Phase 2 was primary flight instruction in the MH-60M Creek, a light training helicopter with about as much in common with an MH-60M as a bicycle has with a Formula One car. Phase 3 was advanced qualification, where candidates who survived learned to fly the platforms they'd actually be assigned. The attrition rate across the full program averaged 31%. In Brower's section specifically, it ran closer to 40%. Brower ran Phase 1 ground school himself. He ran it the way he ran everything, like a controlled experiment in pressure. He asked questions to catch people, not to teach them. He called on the candidates he thought were weakest first, let them struggle in front of the group, then answered the question himself with a precision and speed that made the struggling look worse by comparison. On day 3, he called on Lena Carr during the session on auto-rotation, the emergency procedure a helicopter pilot uses when the engine fails and the rotor has to spin freely to generate enough lift to land without dying. "Carr," he said, "you're at 500 feet, engine failure. What's your first action?" "Lower the collective to reduce pitch and maintain rotor RPM," she said. "Simultaneously adjust the cyclic to establish best glide airspeed, approximately 65 knots in the TH-67. Brower looked at her for a moment. "Then what?" "Select the landing zone. Check rotor RPM is in the green. At approximately 100 feet, flare the aircraft to reduce forward speed and increase rotor inertia. At 10 to 15 feet, level the aircraft and apply collective to cushion the landing." He said nothing for 3 seconds. That was the Brower version of acknowledgement. "Textbook," he said. "Textbook is what gets you through the written test. Textbook is not what keeps you alive at night, in rain, in a helicopter that's been shot up. But fine, textbook. He moved to the next candidate. She did not react. She wrote nothing down. She had not been writing anything down since day one, a fact that Brower had noticed and logged internally as a sign of either overconfidence or poor study habits, neither of which were qualities he associated with candidates who made it through. She didn't need to. The material was elementary to her, not because she was dismissive of it, but because she had lived it. She had made auto-rotation decisions in moving darkness at altitudes where the ground below her was enemy-held and the margin for error was measured in feet, not hundreds of feet. She sat in the back row of that classroom, and she let Dale Brower think she was marginal, and she did it so convincingly that by the end of day 3, she had heard him describe her to another instructor as the one I'll probably have to cut by end of phase 1. She heard it because she was meant to hear it. He had said it in a hallway, not quite quietly enough. An old Brower trick, she suspected. Give them the bad news in a way that lets them quit on their own. Save the paperwork. Lena Carr went back to the barracks, ate a meal alone, did 45 minutes of deliberate breathing exercises she had learned from a JSOC performance psychologist, and went to sleep. The first actual flight was on day 7. The MH-60M Creek is a small, light, responsive training helicopter, a Eurocopter EC-120 variant modified for military use. It has a single engine, a 5-blade rotor, a narrow cockpit designed for 2 side-by-side, and handling characteristics that take most first-time rotary wing pilots several hours to begin to feel comfortable with. The cabin smells of hydraulic fluid and sweat and old vinyl, the particular smell of every training aircraft that has been shared by 100 hands. The cyclic sits between the knees. The collective is on the left, a long handle that controls the pitch of all the rotor blades simultaneously. The anti-torque pedals work like rudder controls in a fixed wing, managing the tail rotor to keep the aircraft tracking straight and controlled. To someone who had never flown a helicopter, the coordination required was counterintuitive, bordering on overwhelming. Every input affected every other input. Pull the collective and the torque changes, requiring a pedal adjustment. Push the cyclic forward and the aircraft pitches and accelerates, requiring a collective adjustment to maintain altitude. It was not the machine that most new students expected. It punished inattention and rewarded not brute force, but sensitivity, a quality of listening through the hands to what the aircraft was actually doing as opposed to what the pilot intended. Brower flew the first demo himself, then handed controls to each candidate in sequence for a 10-minute familiarization flight. He sat in the left seat. The candidate sat in the right. The idea was to give them enough of a feel to understand what was coming in primary instruction. When Lena Carr sat down in the right seat and strapped in, Brower ran through the standard pre-flight briefing without looking at her directly. She listened and watched his hands as he demonstrated the collective and cyclic and anti-torque pedals. And when he finished and told her to place her hands on the controls and follow along, she did exactly that. She made her inputs light, barely enough pressure to feel the control response. She let the aircraft move exactly as it was going to move without her input, which meant the ride was slightly rougher than it would have been if she'd let her actual instincts take over. The aircraft wandered in a gentle side drift that a pilot of her experience would have corrected automatically. A correction so minor it would have been invisible to anyone watching. A pressure change in the palm of the hand, a quarter-inch of pedal, and she let it drift. She let the nose yaw a degree before she brought it back, slowly, like someone learning to feel the correction for the first time. After 4 minutes, Brower said, "You're fighting it." "Yes, Sergeant." "Relax your grip. These aren't car controls." "Yes, Sergeant." She loosened her grip by a fraction. The aircraft steadied. Brower said nothing. He took controls back. He flew them around the pattern once more, smooth and efficient, showing what it was supposed to feel like. The aircraft, perfectly trimmed, moving with a kind of precision that came from 9 years of instructing and the accumulated muscle memory of 10,000 similar movements. She watched his hands. She did not need to, but watching was the correct behavior, and she performed it correctly. Then he handed them back to her and said, "Try again." She flew the next 6 minutes exactly as well as she needed to, not worse, not better. She let herself look like someone who had absorbed the correction, but was still finding the feel, which required more active management than simply flying the aircraft would have. True incompetence is its own kind of performance, and she had prepared for this one as carefully as she had prepared for anything. When they landed, Brower wrote in his notes, "Car, below average control feel, shows limited natural aptitude for rotary wing. Continue monitoring." She had sat close enough to see the notepad. She had read it and looked away and thought, "Good." On day 12, Brower ran a group exercise he called the pressure evaluation. He stood all 19 candidates in a horseshoe around a whiteboard in the main instruction bay and went candidate by candidate, asking a series of rapid-fire systems questions while the group watched. The format was simple. You answered or you didn't. If you didn't, he moved on. At the end, the number of questions each candidate had answered correctly was read aloud to the group. He had designed it to produce a ranking. Rankings in a group of competitive pilot candidates produced dynamics that Brower found useful. They divided the strong from the uncertain. They put pressure on the ones in the middle. They gave him information. He went through 16 candidates before he got to Lena Carr. Her number at that point would have been 11 correct out of 16 questions. She had tracked the count. When he got to her, he asked 9 questions in 2 minutes. They ranged from rotor system mechanics to emergency procedures to weather pattern recognition to basic navigation. She answered 7 correctly, missed 2 intentionally, 1 on a specific avionics system that she had memorized in detail, 1 on a weight and balance formula she could have written out from memory. When he read the numbers aloud, Carr's total put her third from last. "Carr," he said, still looking at his notepad, "I'm going to save us both some time and tell you directly, you are not tracking toward a passing threshold. You are behind. You are behind where you should be on ground school retention. You are behind on control field. And you are the only candidate in this cohort I genuinely do not believe will make it through phase 2. He looked up. "That's not a threat. That's an assessment. You have 2 weeks to change my mind, or I will recommend your separation from the program." Questions. The room was completely quiet. 18 people were looking at her. She looked at him the way she had looked at the tree line on day 1, straight, calm, measuring nothing. "No, Sergeant. Dismissed for lunch." She walked out. She walked down the hall and out the side door into the heat, and she stood on the concrete apron outside the instruction building with her back against the wall and the Alabama sun hitting her full in the face. And she breathed slowly, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. And she thought about the 11 soldiers she had pulled out of that burning LZ in Afghanistan, and about the specific weight of an MH-60M with a full complement of wounded and almost no fuel, and a tail rotor that was making a sound it had never been designed to make. And then she went back inside and ate her lunch. The barracks at Fort Novosel were standard issue. Concrete block walls, 4 bunks to a room, a window that faced the flight line and let in the sound of occasional night operations, and the white noise of the Alabama tree frogs, and whatever wind came up from the southwest, carrying the faint salt smell of the Gulf. The other candidates in her room were asleep by 2200. She could hear the rhythm of their breathing, and the particular flat silence of a room full of people who have been exhausted by deliberate design and collapsed into sleep with the uncomplicated efficiency of bodies that have no more reserves for the day. She sat on her bunk and listened to all of it. The night before the MH-60 landed, Lena Carr did not sleep. It wasn't anxiety. She had long ago made peace with the particular quality of insomnia that arrived before something was about to change. She had felt it the night before her first combat mission in Afghanistan. She had felt it the night before she made the decision to transfer out of the Night Stalkers and disappear. She recognized it now the way you recognize a sound you've heard in many different rooms, the same underneath, no matter the walls around it. She sat on her bunk in the dark, and she thought about the mission. There are things that cannot be briefed over a standard communications channel. There are decisions that require a particular kind of person to be standing in a particular room, hearing the words directly, with no record of the conversation existing anywhere that could be found. When those decisions need to be made, the people who make them do not send an email. They do not make a phone call. They send a black helicopter. She had known it was coming. Not the exact day, not the exact hour. She had known in the way that people with her particular background learn to know things by reading the spaces between information rather than the information itself. The last communication she had received 3 weeks ago had contained one sentence embedded in a message that looked like administrative noise. Packages confirmed. Delivery will be direct. Which meant they were not going to ask her through channels. They were coming to her. She sat in the dark and she thought about what they were going to ask. She had a good idea. There were only a few missions in the current theater of operations that would require a pilot with her specific qualifications. Specifically, the combination of her clearance level, her MH-60M hours, and the 11 specific language and cultural preparation hours she had logged in a country that did not appear on her accessible service record. She was not afraid of what they were going to ask. She sat with it in the dark, in the Fort Novosel barracks, in the Alabama heat, and she made her peace with it the way she always did, by deciding that she had already made the decision and everything from here was just the execution. It was a practice she had developed during her second year with the Night Stalkers, when the missions had become complex enough that the decision to go had to be made separately from the process of going, or the weight of it would compromise the process. You made the decision. You sat with it until it was yours entirely. And then you stopped carrying it into the cockpit where it could not help you. At 0300, she lay down and closed her eyes and was asleep in 3 minutes. The sound came at 0538. Not every candidate on the post heard it. Some slept through it. Some heard it and rolled over, because helicopter sounds at Fort Novosel were the background music of the place, woven into the noise of the base the way engine sounds are woven into the noise of an airport. You stopped hearing them the way you stop hearing air conditioning after the first hour in a room. But Lena Carr heard it. She was already dressed. She had been dressed for 20 minutes, sitting on her bunk with her hands on her knees, and when the sound came, she recognized it immediately. Not just as a helicopter, but as a specific helicopter. The MH-60M has a modified main rotor blade, composite construction, with a blade tip speed and chord geometry that produces a sound signature slightly different from the standard UH-60. It is not a dramatic difference. It is the kind of difference that only registers to someone who has spent enough hours under those blades that the sound has been indexed somewhere in their nervous system at a level below conscious thought. She stood up. She picked up nothing, no bag, no kit. She walked out of the barracks. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was still dark in the west and beginning to go grey-purple in the east, and the MH-60 was on final approach to the main tarmac, running lights off, descending at an angle that was deliberate and precise, and slightly more aggressive than training approach standards, because the person flying it had not bothered to fly at training approach standards for the better part of a decade. It touched down clean. The rotors were still turning when the side door opened. The first figure out was a colonel. Aide-de-camp, briefcase, the particular controlled urgency walk of a man who operates in proximity to stars and has absorbed their cadence. He stepped down and moved clear of the rotor wash without looking back. The second figure out was a general, then a second general, then a third. 3 general officers on a flight line at Fort Novosel at 0538 in the pre-dawn dark, in a helicopter that had arrived without a filed flight plan and without radio contact with the tower and without any communication to the post command whatsoever. The duty officer on the tarmac, a young lieutenant who had seen many things in his 18 months at Fort Novosel and thought himself reasonably unshockable, stood very still and said nothing. One of the generals, the one in the center, a 2-star, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been built for exactly this kind of morning, turned to the aide-de-camp and said one thing. The aide-de-camp nodded and spoke into a radio. 40 seconds later, a voice crackled back. The aide-de-camp turned to the general. "She's walking across the east apron now, sir." The general nodded. "Good." Dale Brower had been on the tarmac since 0520. He always arrived before his candidates. He was standing at the near end of the flight line with a clipboard and a thermos of black coffee, doing his standard morning review of the day's schedule when the MH-60 came in. He watched it land with the professional attention of a man who spent his working life around aircraft, tracking the approach angle, the flare, the touchdown. Clean bird, clean pilot. He noted the running lights were off. He noted the absence of radio chatter. He noted the way the rotor wash was managed. Whoever was flying it had done this before. Then the doors opened and the stars came out. Brower set his clipboard down very carefully on the wing of the nearest aircraft. He had been in the army for 23 years. He recognized what 3 generals on his tarmac at this hour without notice meant, in the abstract, as a category of event. He could not immediately produce a specific precedent because he had never seen it before. He was still processing when he saw her. She was walking across the east apron from the direction of the barracks, hands at her sides, pace unhurried, the way someone walks when they know exactly where they are going and have no concern about arriving. She was in her standard candidate uniform, the same thing she wore every day. And she was carrying nothing. She walked directly toward the three generals. The aide-de-camp saw her first and straightened slightly. The colonel saw her and stepped to the side to clear a path. The two-star in the center watched her coming from 50 meters out. She stopped in front of him. She brought her hand up in a salute that was precise in a way that had nothing to do with training regulations. It was the salute of someone who had rendered it 10,000 times in genuine circumstances. The general returned it. "Night watch," he said. Not a greeting, an identification. The way you use a call sign in an environment where you are not going to use real names. "Sir," she said, "we need to talk." "Yes, sir." He glanced past her. Brower was standing 40 feet away, coffee in hand, clipboard forgotten, watching. The general did not acknowledge him. He turned and gestured toward the helicopter, and Lena Carr turned with him. And the three generals and their aide-de-camp and the woman who was currently ranked third from last in a 20-person pilot candidate cohort walked to the side of the MH-60 and began a conversation that no one else on Fort Novosel was going to hear. Dale Brower stood on that tarmac for 4 minutes before his legs started working again. He was a man who believed with genuine conviction that he understood people. It was not a vanity. It was a professional tool that he had built over 2 decades of running candidates through pressure environments. He could read a recruit's body language and tell you within 3 days whether they were going to make it. And he was right, often enough that he had stopped questioning the instinct. He had been wrong about Lena Carr. The specific quality of his wrongness was not something he could immediately name, standing there on the tarmac. He could see the shape of it, the thin candidate file, the apparent hesitation, the scores that were never quite failing but never quite strong. And he could feel the thing that had been beneath that surface the whole time, and that he had not looked for, because his prior assessment had stopped him from looking. She had been performing, not badly, not transparently. She had been performing with the precision of someone who had calibrated the performance to produce exactly one outcome: the underestimation. And she had hit that outcome with the same exactness that her actual service record said she hit everything she aimed at. One of the junior instructors, Warrant Officer Chin, walked up beside him. "You know who she is?" Chin asked. "No," Brower said. "Me neither." Chin watched the group at the helicopter. "But I know what that bird is. That's a 161st aircraft." He said it quietly. "Night Stalkers." Brower said nothing. "They don't send that kind of hardware to pick up a training candidate," Chin said. "No," Brower said. "They don't." Inside the helicopter, with the rotors at idle and the door closed, the two-star, whose name was General Rowan Hessler, laid out the situation in the efficient, minimal way of a man who had learned that time is a resource with a finite supply, and that the people he was talking to were already tracking most of it. There was an American intelligence officer being held at a location in a country Hessler named without ceremony. The location was inside an urban center that made any kind of ground approach an operation measured in days of planning. The officer had been there for 19 days. The window for retrieval was closing, not because of operational complexity, but because intelligence had confirmed that within 48 hours the officer would be moved to a secondary location with an entirely different security posture and a different set of complications. The rescue mission had been designed around an MH-60M night infiltration. The planned route required flying below radar coverage through terrain that Lena Carr had specific experience navigating. She had flown a similar route on a classified mission 14 months ago, and that experience was the only reason she was the pilot they were asking for. "We had two options," Hessler said. "Bring you back to the unit and brief you there, or brief you here and let you make your choice with full information." "Why here?" she asked. "Because if you come back, it's on record, and you're back in the unit, and the mission goes whether you want it to or not. Here, you can say no." She looked at him. "I'm not going to say no," she said. Hessler studied her for a moment. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know you had the option." When the door of the MH-60 opened again, Lena Carr stepped out first. She walked back across the tarmac, the same way she had walked across it going in. Unhurried, hands at her sides. The sky had moved from grey-purple to a pale orange-gold in the east. The heat was already building, pressing down from somewhere above the pines. Brower was still there. He had not moved. She walked toward the barracks. She would need 10 minutes to pull what she had. There was nothing worth taking from a cover identity that was ending. She would need to change into the set of clothes she had kept in the bottom of her footlocker for this exact moment. Not a candidate uniform, not a training kit. Something else. She was 8 feet from Brower when he spoke. "Carr." She stopped. She looked at him. Full eye contact for the first time since the first morning. Since he had walked down the line and stopped in front of her and told 19 people she was the weakest thing he had seen in 9 years. He said nothing for a moment. He was working through something. She could see it. "How many hours?" he asked. The question was quiet, stripped of everything but the question itself. She held his gaze for a moment. "Enough," she said. She walked past him and did not look back. Of the 19 candidates in the cohort, 8 of them witnessed some part of what happened on the tarmac that morning. They saw different pieces of it, from different angles, at different distances. None of them saw all of it, but they assembled the full picture later, in the mess hall, in the particular way that groups of people in close quarters assemble stories. Fragment by fragment, each person contributing the part they were standing closest to. The candidate who had laughed barely that first morning when Brower called her the weakest thing he'd ever seen. His name was Gareth Holt, and he sat in the mess hall over scrambled eggs that had gone cold and said nothing for a long time while the others talked. Then he said, "She never looked nervous. Not once. Not a single day." Nobody disagreed with that. "I thought it was stubbornness," Holt said, "or the wrong kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't know it's misplaced." He pushed his eggs around the plate. It wasn't either of those things, was it? Another candidate, Yemi Adeyemi, who had the highest score in the cohort on the Phase 1 ground school tests, said, "The way she answered Brower's questions, she never wrote anything down." "I noticed that," someone else said. "She was performing," Adeyemi said, "the whole time, getting the questions right enough not to fail, but wrong enough not to stand out. That takes more control than just knowing the material." She paused. "That's a skill." What the candidates would learn piece by piece over the following weeks, through the particular military information network that is simultaneously informal and deeply accurate, was this. Lena Carr had joined the Army at 22 and qualified for Army aviation before her 24th birthday. She had flown the UH-60 for 2 years before being selected for the 161st SOAR, an invitation that fewer than 1 in 200 eligible aviators ever receive, and that most eligible aviators never get close enough to consider. The 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Night Stalkers, the most elite helicopter unit in the American military, the unit that flies the missions that no other unit can fly, low altitude, high speed, in the dark, in weather, into environments where the failure rate of anything less than perfect is a body count. She had been in the Night Stalkers for 6 years. She had accumulated more than 1,800 flight hours across 3 combat deployments. She had received commendations she could not describe in any unclassified setting. She had flown missions she would never be able to name to anyone without a matching clearance level, and she had come to Fort Novosel, to a basic aviation training pipeline she could have instructed in her sleep, because the mission she was about to fly required an approach vector through terrain she had flown once before, in the dark, at high speed, under fire, and the institutional memory of that approach route existed in exactly one place: her. She had come here to disappear while the mission was finalized, to exist for 3 weeks in a place where no one would look for her, to be Dale Brower's weakest candidate, the woman on the edge of being cut, visible to no one who mattered. Until the helicopter came. General Hessler found Brower before they left. He did not have to. It was not protocol, and it was not required. He chose to. He walked across the tarmac to where Brower was standing, and he stopped in front of him, and Brower came to attention out of reflex. And Hessler said, "At ease," and waited for Brower's shoulders to come down fractionally. "She asked us not to tell you anything," Hessler said. "But I think you deserve one thing." Brower said nothing. "The mission she's flying tonight," Hessler said, "the approach route, she's the only pilot currently serving who has flown that exact terrain at that altitude in those conditions." Brower looked at him. "She's the only one," Hessler said, "in the entire United States military. We didn't pick her because she was available. We picked her because there is no one else." Brower took that in. "She spent 3 weeks letting you think she was the weakest thing you'd ever seen," Hessler said, not unkindly. "She did it because it was the right operational cover for what she needed. And it worked, didn't it?" "Yes, sir," Brower said. Hessler nodded once. He turned and walked back towards the helicopter. Brower stood there and watched them lift off. The MH-60 rising cleanly from the tarmac, nose dipping slightly as it accelerated, climbing out over the pines and banking south. He watched it until the sound of it was gone and the sky was just sky again. Then he picked up his clipboard and went back to work. He had 18 candidates left. They needed a sergeant. Inside the MH-60, climbing south toward the Gulf Coast, and the transport waiting to take them the rest of the way, Lena Carr was in the left seat. She had asked. Not expected it. Asked. And the pilot who had flown the bird up from Hurlburt Field had slid over without comment, because you do not argue with the service record they had shown him before briefing, and you do not argue with the way a woman settles into an aircraft. She knows the way she knows her own hands. She ran the systems checks with the calm efficiency of someone for whom they were automatic, not rushed, not labored, just moving through the sequence with the economy of motion that only accumulates after 1,000 identical repetitions. Her hands found each control without searching. Her eyes tracked the instruments without being directed. The aide-de-camp sitting in the jump seat behind the cockpit, watched her do this and made no notes, but thought several things. The helicopter leveled off at cruise altitude. Alabama fell away below them, the pine forests and red clay fields going flat and then smaller and then abstract, the way everything does from altitude. Lena Carr set the trim and took one breath and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like herself. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was not relief or triumph or vindication. It was simply the sensation of precision returning to her, like circulation returning to a hand that has been held in an awkward position too long. The aircraft responded to her the way the aircraft always responded to her. Honestly, immediately, without delay or distortion. She thought about the terrain she was going to fly tonight. She thought about the approach route. The specific corridor, low and fast and dark, through the geography she had memorized 14 months ago, in conditions that had not allowed her to be anything less than exactly right. She thought about the intelligence officer waiting in a room in a city she was not going to name out loud until she was inside it. She thought, let's go get them. The mission ran that night. It ran in darkness, in silence, at altitudes and speeds that required a level of precision that the aircraft's instruments could support, but that ultimately depended on the pilot, on the calibrated, committed, practiced judgment of the person with hands on the controls. She had spent 6 hours in the transport, reviewing the approach in the dark, running it in her head the way she always ran a mission before it was real. From the initial point to the landing zone, detail by detail, anticipating each decision point in the sequence, building the route until it was not a plan, but a memory. The terrain she was flying through existed in her mind with a specificity that maps could not replicate. She remembered the way the valley floor curved 15 degrees left of heading at the 4-kilometer mark. She remembered the rise on the eastern edge and the narrow channel through it, and the exact airspeed at which the MH-60M would clear the top with adequate margin. She remembered all of it the way she remembered her own name. The MH-60M came in over the terrain at a height that kept it below the radar coverage and below the noise threshold of the city's populated areas. Flying this low, this fast, at night, the world outside the cockpit was a dark blur of shapes. The instruments were what mattered, and the instruments were green. The approach required 4 course corrections, each one calculated in the 3 seconds of airspace before it became necessary, each one made with the kind of stillness that is not the absence of calculation, but its completion. There was no hesitation in any of them. There was no second guessing. She had made the decisions before the moment arrived, and when the moment arrived, she was already past it. The landing zone was a courtyard, 41 feet wide. The MH-60M's rotor diameter is 53 feet 6 inches. She landed in it. The space was smaller than regulation minimums by 11 feet. On both sides, the rotor tips cleared the courtyard walls with less margin than the training manuals would have allowed, and more margin than she needed, because she had placed the aircraft exactly where she intended to place it, and the math had been correct. The intelligence officer was extracted in under 4 minutes. There was a team on the ground who had been holding position for 2 days, waiting for this window, and they moved the officer to the aircraft with the practiced urgency of people who have spent a great deal of time in situations where every second spent in a location is a second of exposure. The officer was placed in the back. The team loaded, the door closed. On the way out, under fire from a position that had been slower to respond than intelligence had predicted, but had ultimately responded. Lena Carr flew the MH-60M at 63 feet above the terrain at maximum continuous power, with weapons fire tracking across the upper tail section. And she did not climb, and she did not change her heading, and she did not increase her reaction rate above the baseline that the situation required. Climbing would have exposed the belly of the aircraft to the angle of fire. Changing heading would have added distance. She ran the numbers in real time, without a calculator and without deliberation, and the numbers said, hold altitude, hold heading, hold speed, and the covering fire from the team in the back would deal with the source. The covering fire dealt with the source. She was exactly as fast as necessary, exactly as controlled as the aircraft demanded. Not 1 degree of excess. They cleared the city limits. They gained altitude. The weapons fire fell behind and below. In the back, someone said something. She didn't hear the words, only the tone, the particular release of pressure that happens in a sealed cabin when the immediate threat is past. She flew them home. 3 weeks later, a document arrived at Fort Novosel. It came through standard administrative channels, routed to the commanding officer's desk. It was not addressed to Dale Brower. It did not reference him. It was addressed to the post command, and it contained a request, framed as a standard administrative note, to update the personnel record of a candidate who had separated from the training program. The update was brief. It instructed the post to amend the candidate's file status from separated, voluntary to detached, classified reassignment, and attached to it, in a folder marked with the classification level that required Brower's commanding officer to step out of his own office to read it in a secure room, were 3 pages of material. The CO did not share what was in those 3 pages. He was not permitted to. But Brower, who had been in the Army for 23 years and who understood how information moves through a building even when no one is speaking it directly, put together enough to understand the broad shape. He understood that the woman he had called the weakest candidate he had seen in 9 years had flown a mission that 3 pages of classified documentation considered significant enough to attach to a training record. He sat with that for a while. Then he went to the instruction bay and started his morning class, and asked the first candidate the first question of the day and listened to the answer. He was a better instructor that day in ways he would not have been able to name. Yemi Adeyemi graduated from Phase 2 of the Fort Novosel aviation program 11 weeks after Lena Carr left. On graduation day, at the small ceremony on the tarmac where the successful candidates received their wings, Brower gave a brief address, the kind of address he gave every cycle, functional and direct, about what the wings meant and what was expected of the people wearing them. Afterward at the reception, Adeyemi found him by the coffee table and said what she had been holding for 3 months. "She was the best of us," Adeyemi said, "wasn't she?" Brower looked at her. "Yes," he said. It did not cost him anything to say it. He had processed it already over weeks, and what was left was just the truth of it, clean and without remainder. "Did you know?" Adeyemi asked. "No," he said. Adeyemi nodded. She poured her coffee. She thought about what it meant to be the best candidate in a room and to spend 3 weeks making sure no one knew it. And she thought about the discipline that required, not the flying skill, which she had no frame to evaluate, but the interpersonal precision, the sustained performance of mediocrity, the patient management of every interaction to ensure that a specific impression was maintained. What was her call sign? Adeyemi asked. That I can't tell you, Prowess said. She nodded again. She understood that. She looked out at the tarmac, the same tarmac where the MH-60 had landed 3 months ago in the pre-dawn dark for a woman who had been sitting in a barracks and waiting for it without appearing to wait. She thought, whoever she is, wherever she is, I hope she's flying tonight. Somewhere, in the dark, an MH-60M moves at low altitude over terrain that has no name on any accessible map. The pilot's hands are on the controls. The instruments are green. The aircraft is exactly where it is supposed to be, doing exactly what it was built to do, flown by someone who was built for this in ways that accumulated over years of decisions that looked small from the outside and were enormous from the inside. She is not thinking about Fort Novosel. She is not thinking about Dale Brower's voice on a hot Alabama tarmac, or the sound of a single candidate laughing, or the number of words she did not say over 3 weeks of careful performance. She is thinking about the terrain. She is thinking about the approach. She is thinking about the people she is going to bring home. That is the only thought that matters at 60 feet and maximum continuous power in the dark. Everything else, every slight, every assessment, every official determination that she was the weakest thing someone had seen in years, belongs to a different altitude, a lower one. Up here, there is only the aircraft and the dark and the precision that no one can take from her, because it was never visible to them in the first place. Up here, she is exactly who she has always been. Night Watch. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of what she carried and the quiet power of how she carried it, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Silent Salute Stories for more of the people behind the uniform who never once asked to be seen.